Good evening. First, I'd like to acknowledge and thank SCI-Arc Director Eric Owen Moss, the Student Lecture Committee, and Wendy for inviting Professor Mitchell and for making this evening happen. I'm personally very pleased at the opportunity to introduce Professor Mitchell, as his influence, support, and intellect upon my own and many of my peers' trajectories of practice, research, and teaching dates back 30 years. Sorry for that, Bill. Before enumerating Professor Mitchell's bio, it must be sort of premised with a few, ideally humorous anecdotes. One must ask, what does a dean do after being dean? In Professor Mitchell's case, it seems he just never stopped and does whatever interests him. And I think it would be nice for all of us to achieve that. I expect he will show the work he is leading, ranging from urban transportation systems, interactive architecture, and urbanism, and his research into design, computation, and design development. Once in a time of despair, I asked how it was that he was so prolific and maintained so much energy. And he says he starts at 5 a.m. every day when the kids aren't awake and no one's calling him. I actually did take that advice for about 6 months just to finish. Another example of his unique energy and sense for collaboration is Professor Mitchell is the first professor, and now there have been others, but there's the first professor to come into a design charrette for a project that I'm sure he will show with a very critical eye and a bunch of exuberance, basically cutting into a series of car designs as lacking bling. He is also one of the only professors I've worked with who can wax poetic on the art of dodging kangaroos at high speeds in the outback of Australia. Now on to more serious things, I guess. William J. Mitchell is the Alexander Dreyfus Professor of Architecture and Media, Arts and Sciences at MIT, the director of the MIT Design Laboratory, and director of the MIT Media Lab's Smart Cities Research Group. His research focuses upon new strategies for architectural design and production, digital media, and cities in the era of large-scale digital networks. Among his publications, which are way too many to list tonight, so I'll do only a few, is Imagining MIT, Designing a Campus for the 21st Century, Placing Words, Symbols, Spaces in the City, 2005, City of Bits, which I assume many of you know, Space Place in the Infobahn, The Reconfigured Eye, The Visual Truth in the Post-Photographic Era, 1992, and two of my favorites, which really I think are important for design computation, The Logic of Architecture, Design, Computation, and Cognition, 1990, and then way back, Computer-Aided Architectural Design, 1977. From 1992 to 2003, he served as Dean of the School of Architecture and Planning at MIT and was the architectural advisor for the president of MIT during its recent major building campaign, of which there's a Stephen Hall building, forgetting the Correa building, and obviously the Frank Gehry Data Center. Previously, he held faculty positions at UCLA, where he was head of the architecture and urban design programs. He's taught at Cambridge University in Cambridge, England, and was at the Harvard Graduate Design School of Design prior to being at MIT. He received his architectural training at the University of Melbourne and at Yale. He is a fellow of the Royal Australian Institute of Architects and a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Finally, it must be said, from me anyways, that Professor Mitchell's influence is pervasive. His record of aiding practitioners, innovators, entrepreneurs, governments, and institutions is fairly exhaustive. And his list of advisees over the last 30 years is even longer. For me, his energy and generosity is pretty unflappable. And finally, when his students assemble, which some of us do once in a while, we often proudly sort of lay claim to the moniker of an SOB. So many of us are, in a sense, thankful to have had his time, his ear, and his advice, and ultimately the chance to be such an SOB, which is, in other words, a student of Bill. Please welcome Bill Mitchell.
Well, thank you. It's terrific to be back here. It's years since I've been at SCI-Arc, I think, so it's wonderful to be back here. In fact, I haven't been in this building at all, so I'm thrilled to see it. I'm thrilled to see the growth of the school. I'm thrilled to see the energy of the work that I sense as I walk through here. So it's a whole lot of fun, and glad to be here. I'm going to talk to you this evening about the recent work that we've been doing in my group at the MIT Media Lab. The Smart Cities group is a cross-disciplinary group that deals with really design problems that don't fit within the traditional disciplinary boundaries. Roughly, they're architectural problems, I think. My roots absolutely are as an architect, but they cut across the boundaries of urban design, of software, of digital networking, and the various other kinds of technologies that I'll talk a little bit about as we go through this evening. We've been doing a variety of different projects, all of which have fairly high technology content. I was quite thrilled this week. Time magazine put out their list of 50 inventions of the year, and two of them are ones that came out of my lab. I'll talk about one of them this evening, the CityCar project, and another one, the water pavilion, which I won't talk about, but you can take a look in the magazine and check that one out. So the general direction we've been pursuing is to attack really what I take to be fundamental architectural and urban design and social problems using a repertoire of technologies that's perhaps not the usual repertoire of technologies. So the two projects I'll talk about this evening are the CityCar project, which is a project we've been doing in collaboration with General Motors for the last couple of years, and a project we call the RoboScooter, for a little electric motor scooter that was just introduced at the Milan Auto Show yesterday. So you'll see the first pictures, in fact, of the RoboScooter this evening. The CityCar, firstly, you see one of the versions of it shown in this image here, is a new approach to urban personal mobility based on the assumption that the automobile is very rapidly dying at this point, and however, the need for personal mobility, for convenient personal mobility, is not going to go away, but we're going to have to do it in an energy efficient way, and we're going to have to do it in a way that doesn't produce huge amounts of greenhouse gases and change the climate of the globe. So the approach that we've taken here, and I'll explain this project to you in detail in a moment, is to make a small footprint, lightweight vehicle that folds and stacks like shopping carts at the supermarket or like luggage carts at the airport. These little cars have all of the basic components of the automobile in the wheels. We did what everybody tells you should never do in a design project. We reinvented the wheel in this project. And we got rid of all kinds of useless stuff that's in a traditional automobile. We got rid of engines. We got rid of the powertrain. We got rid of steering wheels. We got rid of a whole lot of stuff and reduced the thing back to its essentials as a mobility device, and made something that's very small and very simple and very light. This thing is the size of a smart car when it's unfolded, and when it's folded up it has half the footprint of a smart car. So that's the dimensions of this project, the basic outline of this project. Let me just show you a couple of slides that suggest why this kind of project is important, why I think it's vital for architects and urban designers to really address this kind of issue in an innovative way. This is the century of the city. It's the century of urbanization. There's kind of a fashion towards the end of the 1990s to think that digital telecommunication and the death of distance that was anticipated at that point would maybe dissolve cities and kind of smear everything across the landscape in a non-urban kind of way. Of course, that never happened. That certainly was never something I expected to happen either. In fact, we've moved into a century of very, very rapid urbanization. And as probably most of you know, in the 21st century, century, about 90% of population growth is going to be in urban areas. These urban areas of the world already account for more than 50% of the world's population. We reached that point about a year ago. It's going to move up to 60% pretty quickly. Not only will a lot of the population be in cities, but the huge concentration of wealth will be in cities also. Something like 80% of the wealth of the world will be in cities. And so if you're concerned fundamentally about urban sustainability and sustainability of the globe generally, the pattern of future energy demand that is determined by urban networks is a really fundamental thing to look at. And if you look at this in a bit more detail, you rapidly see that transportation and building operations typically account for something like 60% of total urban energy use. And some of this is incredibly irrational. I looked at some figures a little while back that revealed that in Manhattan, at peak times, something like 40% of total gasoline use is in cars just driving around looking for parking. Now, this is not rational. There has to be a better way to organize things than this. So this is a major, major issue. How do we deal with it? Well, I'd like to suggest to you that incremental efficiency gains are not going to get us to where we need to be. Incremental efficiency gains, new gadgets, new fuels, new ways of dealing with things that gain little increments of efficiency are certainly important and worth pursuing, but they're not going to suffice to make a big dent, the sort of big dent that we need in overall urban energy usage. Furthermore, as I think most of you realize very well, land use, transportation, and energy distribution systems are very, very tightly coupled. You really can't change one without changing the others. So the big potential efficiency gains result from rethinking the whole system. And that's really what we've been about. We've been looking at ways to fundamentally reinvent urban personal transportation. This is an early animation we did to show the basic concept of the CityCar. These things do have doors. It was just when we did this, we didn't know what the doors were going to look like, so we didn't put them in. But here we see the basic model of the CityCar. It's a one-way rental system, a one-way shared use rental system. So you pick up a CityCar from a stack, you drive it to wherever you need to drive it, and then you just drop it off. The cars recharge while they're in the stack. They're like your electric toothbrush. Through inductive charging, they just automatically recharge. Because they automatically recharge, you never have to plug them in, you never think about filling them with gas. The thing just runs. It automatically sucks up the energy that it needs. And furthermore, because of this one-way rental model, which basically comes down to fairly short trips between charging stations, you don't have to carry around a large number of batteries, and you don't have to give the thing a very long range. So you overcome the fundamental Achilles heel of all pure electric vehicles, the deficiencies in battery technology. So here we see the students just demonstrating how they made the animation, just to make sure you understand these things are not quite real. They weren't anyway at the point we did this. So what are the principles? What are the principles of this thing? Well, as I've said, they're shared use two-passenger electric cars that fold and stack like shopping carts. They have robot wheels. Basically, we've taken everything of the fundamental mechanics of an automobile and stuffed it all in the wheels. So drive motors in the wheels. This is a very feasible thing to do now. You can get very small, very efficient, high-torque electric motors that will fit very nicely within automobile wheels. Secondly, we put suspension in the wheels. In-wheel motors don't really work very well unless you put suspension in there too. Otherwise you get lots of unsprung mass and very poor performance, very poor handling. So we put suspension in the wheels. We figured out some ways of getting the suspension in there. Steering is in the wheels, and braking is in the wheels as well. The wheels have a simple snap-on mechanical connection to the body. It's a little bit like snapping a bayonet mount lens onto a camera body, and it's a simple mechanical connection, and it carries electrical and data as well. It's all drive-by-wire, basically. There's no mechanical connections between the controls and the wheels, just a data cable and a signal going in. And these wheels spin at 180 degrees, so you can do all sorts of interesting maneuvers with this thing. They're all independently controlled, so you can do this, for example. You can spin the car on its own axis, so you don't ever have to do U-turns. We do O-turns, as we like to say, instead of U-turns. We just change the alphabet a little. If you want to parallel park, it's really easy. You just drive up like this and then go in sideways, spin the wheels around and go in sideways. Part of our ambition on this is to eliminate everything that might be difficult on a driving test, to make everything so easy that just anybody can get in the car and drive. This also has, the robot wheels and this kind of maneuverability have all sorts of urban advantages too. You can maneuver cars into much tighter spaces than you can with a traditional car. You can execute all kinds of wonderful maneuvers on the roads. They're maneuvers I'm not sure I really want to put in the hands of Boston drivers, but that's a whole other kind of issue about this. So that's the basic mechanics of it. I'll show you how it gets put together in a moment. The basic model is that you have lots of stacks of these cars around the city. You swipe your credit card, pick up a car from a stack and deposit another stack when you're finished. It's like having valet parking everywhere. Now, everybody used to tell us that this sort of one-way rental model was hopelessly utopian, that it could never work, people wouldn't accept it, that you couldn't figure out all of the technical details. We have an existence proof now that this sort of system does work. If you have been in Paris in the last few months, you will have seen that 10,000 rental bicycles have been put on the streets in Paris, and they operate on exactly the same kind of system that we've developed here for the CityCar. There are stacks of bicycles all around Paris now. You swipe an access card to unhook a bicycle from a stack. You ride it to the wherever you want to get off and just leave it at that stack. The system is so efficient that it's able to be provided free for the first half hour, which has already motivated all the kids in Paris to figure out ways to drive stack to stack in 29-minute increments across Paris, which is terrific and part of the model. And the thing really does self-organize. Very, very few bicycles end up in the wrong places. You do a little bit of adjustment of the system to keep the thing tuned properly, but basically it is self-organizing. So this is also a self-organizing one-way system, and it will be very cheap. And as I've said, recharging occurs whenever the vehicle's stacked, so you don't need long range or heavy bulky batteries, and inductive charging is the way to do this. And we've been doing quite a bit of work recently on the physics of inductive charging and ways to make this work. If you don't know about inductive charging, it's the way your electric toothbrush works, and it's the way that inductive cooking tops work. So basically you have a couple of coils, and they transfer energy through the air. And then there are a lot of tricks you can perform with these things, with magnetic resonance and all sorts of clever things that I've just begun to figure out recently, and means that you can do it without vaporizing people, without frying their pacemakers and all of those sorts of unfortunate effects. It really works quite nicely. So the idea is you'd build the inductive charging in the parking spaces. This kind of vehicle architecture enables us fundamentally to rethink manufacturing. We end up with lightweight, strictly modular construction. You don't need large automobile factories to do this kind of thing. You don't need a lot of robots. You don't need big, complicated assembly lines. Standard interfaces between modules, very much like personal computers. We learned a lot from the personal computer industry. No heavy assembly, snap-together construction, sort of like Lego blocks. box. And because of the standardized interfaces, we can anticipate that competition will drive down the price of the modules, particularly the wheel modules. So we expect this to be very much like disk drives of personal computers, which are actually very complicated things, but because of competition, they're very, very cheap these days. Over a period of 20 years, the cost has been driven enormously down, and you can easily customize these things. So that's the strategy. Here's one of our early prototypes of the robot wheel. You might be interested to know that to do this prototype, we used some of the techniques that I've noticed just walking around this evening are very common around here. The basic stuff in here is actually just laser cut wood. Now, when you do a prototype that way, it doesn't last very long, but it's very quick and very cheap, and it's a way to figure out whether the fundamental mechanical principles work or not. And the other technique that we used here, which is very, very powerful now, is to use eBay as a global parts bin. So if you want any kind of weird part, you just go and look on eBay, and almost certainly you'll find it there, and you just buy it, and somebody ships it to you in Federal Express, and it's great. So there are all sorts of little parts in here that we brought on eBay. So what you see here is you can see the drive motor in there. You can see the suspension. There's a little suspension spring, which does have enough suspension travel, incidentally, to do what it needs to do. This one has brake discs, as you can see back there. The more recent ones don't have brake discs because we did some work with Ferrari, and working with the Ferrari engineers, we figured out that you can use these motors as very efficient brakes. So you get rid of the brake discs and get rid of a whole system, and that also fits in with a strategy of using the motors as power generators, the kind of strategy that gets used on hybrid cars, regenerative braking. So this is one of the early prototypes. It works very nicely. It's not by any means as light and simple and elegant as we were aiming for. So we've continued to evolve this technology. And the next image, I can get it. This is the more recent version, much more elegant version, I think, of the robot wheel. A different suspension principle being used here. This does suspension essentially like a Formula One car, except it's done with a couple of leaves of here a couple of leaves of carbon fibre. Snap-on connection works here. You can snap the wheel on and off in literally just a couple of seconds, just with snap-on connection in here. This carries the electrical and data as well. You can see that the stuff in the wheel has become a whole lot simpler. We got rid of the brake discs. It's a whole lot simpler and more elegant. And on this one we have an airless tyre as well. So you use a polymer tyre that is organised so that it has the sort of resilience and structural properties that you want. And this attends to one of the ambitions I have for this thing, which is to get rid of all gases and fluids out of this thing. No gasoline, no oil, no water, no brake fluid, none of these things, and to make the whole thing basically a robotic electronic device. So here's how this one goes together. This is these are just an exploded view showing the pieces. It's actually remarkably simple in the end. And this is one of the principles that we've been looking at. Principle that's introduced in Swatch watches, for example, of trying to make radical simplifications of the system. So you reduce the part count and radically reduce the cost. So these are the pieces. You see the snap-on connection there. And in this case, the batteries go in the axle. So we use A123 batteries, a new kind of battery that are very efficient and have very, very nice properties. And so this is the basic assembly. Here's a half-scale prototype of this thing. And the thing I want you to notice here is that almost nothing there, which is absolutely the point. I mean, a traditional automobile is a very, very complex thing. Lots of parts, lots of stuff, lots of metal. This is almost nothing. So we have the 4 independent robot wheels, which provide drive, steering, suspension, everything you want. The batteries are in the axle there. And here's the digital control system. It's entirely digital and relatively simple circuitry to drive the thing. Not so simple software, I should say, because you've got 4 independent wheels that can all steer independently and can all have independent speeds and independent amount of power going to them and so on. So very interesting control system problem and very, very interesting thing to design for the kind of maneuverability properties you want. A couple of other consequences of this strategy are that most of the driving characteristics of the vehicle are embodied in software rather than hardware. This means you can download them like ringtones on a cell phone. So if you're a 17-year-old with a death wish, you can make it perform like a sports car. If you're my 90-year-old mother who has slow reaction times and wants to drive very stably to the supermarket whenever she wants, then it can adjust to her driving characteristics. So this is a very, very important piece of design freedom that you get by replacing hardware with software. I think this is a very important general principle, incidentally. Also, software weighs nothing, whereas hardware always weighs something, so you get great weight advantages by replacing hardware with software. The other thing we get out of this is redundancy. One of the reasons you don't, in fact, see drive-by-wire cars, fully electronically controlled cars, is you have to provide redundant systems for safety in case the digital system fails. Most automobiles that have some drive-by-wire capability at the moment have backup mechanical systems. Well, if you have a backup mechanical system, you lose a huge amount of the advantage of doing all of this in the first place. But with this system, we have 4 independent wheels, and you can design the control system so it can operate very effectively if you just have 3 wheels active if one of the wheels fails, or even with 2 wheels. This thing is designed to operate with any combination of 4 wheels, any combination of 3 wheels, and any combination of 2 wheels. So you get plenty of redundancy in this thing. The snap-together construction is really quite an interesting thing. We took this one with my crew. I didn't go. My crew took this to demonstrate to our sponsors at General Motors in Detroit, and the way they took it was they snapped it apart, put the pieces in their carry-on baggage, had some extremely interesting conversations with the security people at Logan Airport, but got all of the stuff onto the airplane, got off in Detroit, drove to the General Motors boardroom and snapped it together in the boardroom in 10 minutes. We probably could have caused all kinds of union trouble by assembling automobiles in the boardroom with non-union labour, but anyway, we did it, and you start to see, you see the way this thing works. This starts to show you some of the design freedom that you get by using this robot wheel principle. We can do a folding chassis actually quite easily. Now, this is very important. If you try to fold an internal combustion engine, you really don't get very far. You can't fold a traditional automobile except with immense mechanical complexity. But here we can do it with very little complexity and weight penalty. So it becomes worthwhile, in fact, to fold the automobile in order to get compactness for dense urban situations. So the wheels, the folding chassis, and you can just see how it snaps together in modular fashion. And this is another version. We have many versions of this thing, but this is another version of the automobile. All right, so what do we get out of making a vehicle like this? Well, we get 3 kinds of energy and sustainability efficiencies, and I'm going to take them one by one and explain them to you, beginning with the most obvious one, probably the least important one, and then moving on to some less obvious ones that I think are probably more important. So the obvious one, I'll call the first order efficiencies, very tiny footprint. As I said before, size of a smart car when it's extended, half the size of a smart car when it's folded, and with the headroom and legroom of a 3 Series BMW, and because we get rid of a lot of stuff, we can do this. Much more agile than a traditional car, so it makes much more efficient use of urban infrastructure. Secondly, it does all of the things that you want from a benign urban vehicle. It's lightweight, it's all electric, it's digitally controlled, it's almost silent, and there are absolutely no tailpipe emissions. And the shared use principle does something very interesting for you. It enables very high utilization rate. Traditional automobiles spend about 80% of their time parked, completely useless, burning up space, burning up embodied energy, costing you money. You just have to step out into the parking lot outside here to see what I mean. It's doing absolutely nothing except consuming resources. If you move to a shared use principle, you're able to flip it around and you get about an 80% utilization rate. In other words, the cars are in use about 80% of the time. So you get the same amount of mobility in cities with far fewer vehicles on the road. So this is a very important plus if you want to reduce urban congestion. And it does something interesting for the automobile industry. It transforms the automobile industry from what it is now, which is a low-margin commodity product business, where all automobiles are essentially the same under the skin. They're subject to very intensive price pressure. It's a lousy business, and the American automobile companies are suffering enormously from being in a lousy business. Well, you can flip it around and say, follow the example of Google, which is a service business, an innovative service business that provides a base service and then actually makes a huge amount of money by doing innovative add-on services on top of that base business. So if you think of the issue of urban mobility not as an issue of selling automobiles, but as an issue of providing a mobility service, it becomes actually an extremely interesting business proposition, a way of dealing with the mobility issue. So these are the first order energy efficiencies, essentially much smaller cars, much more benign cars, far fewer of them on the road in order to provide the sort of personal mobility that we want to have in cities. Just to give you an example of how significant that is, I've just made a diagram here where at the top I show a typical Manhattan block. It might be a block on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. These are about 1,000 feet long. In fact, they're exactly 1,000 feet long. If you ignore fire hydrants, loading zones, all of these kinds of things, which people actually do anyway, it's not a bad assumption, you only get about 80 cars parked around the Manhattan block. If you were foolish enough to stack as many of our cars as you possibly could around a block, you'd get more than 500 cars around the block. So you get a compression ratio of something like 6 to 1, more than 6 to 1 here. This is enough, as the urban designers here will recognize, to fundamentally change the basic relationship in a city between the space that's devoted to automobiles and the space that's devoted to productive and humane human occupancy. And this is the kind of big win that we're looking for in pursuing this. It's even more powerful if you look at multi-story parking structures, kind of thing that you see here, sort of thing that you've all laid out, I'm sure, at some point in your careers. Here we see, on the other side, you see the same number of cars done in the kind of stacks that we've developed. And the compression ratio is here almost 9 to 1. It's almost an order of magnitude. And there are some very interesting models for doing these sort of things. For example, you can put a vertical stack in a parking building, in an apartment building. So it's sort of like a Pez dispenser, so that whenever you come out the front door of your apartment building, there's always an automobile sitting there waiting for you to drive away. And you just drop it back in the other end of the stack when you come back. So you start to see the kinds of models and the way it begins to affect not only overall urban land use, but also opens up some very interesting possibilities for building form. Let's just take it up to another level. Okay, so that's the first order efficiencies. Second order energy efficiencies are less obvious and probably more significant in the long run. This has to do with the structure of urban energy supply systems. And I pointed out that you really have to think of transportation, land use, and energy supply as all being part of the same system. So big problem with electrical systems, with electrical grids, is they have no storage capacity. So this means if you get a spike in power demand, for example, it happens on a really hot day in Los Angeles, the only way to handle that is to have backup capacity power plants somewhere that you then throw online, and having that excess capacity is very expensive. Or else you do brownouts and cut people's service. So neither one of these things is a satisfactory response. So spiking in demand is a major, major problem for power grids. Now, the other problem with power grids having no storage is it makes them very unfriendly to clean, intermittent power sources like solar and like wind, because the sun doesn't necessarily shine when you want the energy, and the wind doesn't necessarily blow when you want the energy. So unless you have storage capacity somewhere, you have to have backup capacity, backup generation capacity to back up the solar and back up the wind and so on, and that makes it all extremely expensive and uneconomical. What we can do with this system is to recognize that whenever our cars are parked, they're putting battery capacity into the electrical grid, because whenever they're parked, they're plugged into the electrical grid inductively. So this adds a huge amount of storage capacity, and we're able to start thinking of the automobiles as little intelligent agents that buy and sell electricity. So if electricity currently is cheap, and you know that you're going to very likely to be used in the immediate future, you buy energy. And if energy is currently expensive and you know that you're not going to be used in the fairly near future, then you just dropped a water bottle, sorry. then you sell electricity back to the grid. So this evens out the power spiking, and it makes the whole thing much, much more friendly to clean, sustainable power sources. Also, it opens up the possibility of really starting to think of a city as a smart distributed power generation system composed of sustainable sources. So it starts to be much more economical to put solar panels on the roofs of buildings, for example. It starts to be much more economical to bring wind power into the system. And since you're charging these cars in close proximity to where the electricity is actually generated under this kind of system, you minimize transmission losses, which are an enormous problem with the traditional organization of power grids. Also, if you want to use cogeneration plants, if you're interested in fuel cells, all of these kinds of strategies, these make a lot of sense with this kind of strategy. And makes a lot more sense, incidentally, if you're interested in hydrogen fuel cells, for example, to put them in buildings and charge up the automobiles, charge up the batteries, rather than carry the fuel cells around in automobiles. That's a lot of weight. You're basically carrying a big chemical plant around in an automobile, and it's also highly explosive. Doing our calculations on this, we measured the capacity of these things in hand grenades, which we thought was a dramatic unit to illustrate the explosive capacity of this. So the second order energy efficiency then is to restructure in a fundamental way urban energy systems, and to make sustainable, clean energy a much more attractive proposition. We've done a lot in looking at this kind of thing too, where you start to interconnect different kinds of systems in order to get efficiency. This is actually some work from Imperial College, from some colleagues in Imperial College in London. This is not our work, but we're very interested in, which shows, for example, how you can interconnect the natural gas system, the water system, and the electrical system so that you take maximum advantage of the different kinds of resource streams. So, for example, a traditional water system has pressure-reducing valves to take the high pressure water that comes from a reservoir and break it down to a pressure that doesn't blow your appliances off the walls and so on. Well, instead of doing that, you put a micro turbine in there and generate electricity out of the reduction of reduction of water pressure. and then gas turbine can run in a cogeneration mode where it generates both heat and electricity, and you can begin to see how you can start to make all of these things fit together in a very powerful way. So instead of thinking of a system, a city, as a collection of different systems superimposed, a water system, electrical system, a gas system, and so on, start thinking of them all interconnected intelligently, forming the intelligent metabolism of a city. All right, let me now move on to, this just then illustrates this concept that basically this car is a dual-use device. So when it's in motion, it provides mobility. When it's at rest, it provides the energy storage device that transforms the character of the power grid. All right, the third order efficiencies, and maybe these are the most significant of all. Basically, we think of this device as not simply a device for moving things around, but a device for intelligent utilization of a city's resources based on ubiquitously embedded intelligence and ubiquitous mobile computing. So these vehicles are conceived of from the beginning essentially as networked computers on wheels. We think of the dashboard as being not an interface to the engine, which is a very 19th century idea, but as an interface to the city. And so you end up developing the idea of a map-based interface and a navigational interface in a much more sophisticated way than has been done so far. This is a very crude early conception of this, but you start to get the idea. And this intelligent access to the city's resources involves the automobile intelligently navigating simultaneously three kinds of markets. So, as I've already described to you, these cars know patterns of energy prices and mobility demand, so they intelligently play the energy futures market. They also play a road space market. So how does this work? Well, the basic idea here is you do traffic congestion monitoring on a block-by-block basis in real time, and that's a very feasible technology these days. You do congestion pricing, and you adjust the prices in real time based on the density of traffic at particular locations. So basically, the more traffic going down a road, the more it's going to cost you to add your traffic, add your automobile to that road. This idea of congestion pricing is gaining some traction. Singapore has been doing it for a while. London introduced a congestion ring a couple of years ago. Mayor Bloomberg in New York is trying to do this. We're going to see much more of this kind of thing. But what we're proposing here, and we've developed quite a bit of software for this, is something much more sophisticated. So basically, when you set things up this way, your car navigation system is able to do things like take me the quickest way to my destination subject to a price constraint. I don't want to pay more than $10 or something like this. Or the other way around, take me the cheapest way to my destination subject to a time constraint. So you get a road space market going in which the behavior of these intelligent agents responds to the overall pricing in the system in real time, and the overall pricing in the system responds to the behavior of the agents in real time. So you get a real-time feedback loop going, classic kind of economic system, and as far as I can tell, though we haven't done all of the math on this, this comes to a very nice equilibrium and beautifully allocates demand to the capacity in the road system. So that's the road space market. A similar thing with parking. Imagine a parking, well, firstly, parking is a terrible market. Essentially, it has fixed prices, rigid fixed prices, and you connect buyers to sellers by driving around randomly till you find a parking space. So this is really not very good. Furthermore, parking is very, very underpriced in most cities, as my old UCLA colleague Don Shoup, very good economist, has demonstrated. So how do we change this? Well, put sensors in parking spaces and get the information about parking spaces back to the navigation systems of automobiles, and enable the automobiles to do eBay-style auctions on parking spaces. So basically you can say, look, I'm really desperate right now. I have to find a parking space. I'll pay just about anything. So your car bids high and gets you an expensive but very convenient parking space. Or else you say, I'm a poor student. It's a nice day and I have a little bit of time. I want to save some money. So bid low and probably I'll get a parking space. It's a little bit further away, a little bit less convenient, but it's going to cost me a whole lot less. So essentially these cars become Google for the city, efficiently getting you to the resources of the city while taking account of time and cost constraints. So energy cost by playing the energy market, road space by doing the kind of dynamic road space market that I just described, and parking space. So take these third order efficiencies and you end up having a city that works in a much, much, much more intelligent way. So I just want to show you one more thing about the car, then I'm going to show you another recent project we've done, the RoboScooter project. So there are a number of different ways to organize these systems at an urban scale. This diagram, by the way, shows the control system of the car. So there is no steering wheel. There's basically a double-sided joystick that you drive like this. It comes up on either side of your seat. And you only need to know three things to drive this car: push to accelerate, pull to brake, and go like this to drive. There are no pedals, there are no other controls, there's no key to stick in none of this sort of 19th century stuff. It all gets reduced away to something very, very simple indeed. We built a simulator for this and put it in the MIT Museum and connected it up to an incredibly un-PC video game that involves driving through downtown LA, actually. And it's the most popular exhibit in the MIT Museum. The kids have enormous fun driving this interface. But anyway, the ways in which you can organize these sorts of car systems. So here are some models. This is the one-way shared use system, just conjecturally demonstrated on London, within the congestion zone at London, and just showing 5-minute walking radius, about half a mile, around all of the subway stops. And you see if you put CityCar stacks on all of the subway stops, you get a beautiful coverage and wonderful self-organizing system in something like the center of London. Here's something very different. This is metropolitan New York, and this is just plotting the density of transit stops, of train stops basically, in metropolitan New York. And you can see, as a characteristic of these radial systems, that it's very dense in the, right at the center of the system in lower Manhattan, and then it becomes very, very rapidly much less dense as you go out. So this leaves you with the last 10-kilometer problem, that transit will get you approximately where you want to go, approximately when you want to go, but you still have the problem of getting to your detailed destination in a convenient way. So another way to organize these city car systems is to place stacks of these on transit stops, so they solve the last 10-mile problem. So the model here would be the last 10-kilometer problem. So the model here would be you come home from work, you pick up a car at the transit stop, you drive it around in the evening, you let it recharge at home overnight, and you bring it back to the transit stop the next morning. Here's another way to do it, a linear system. This is something we've been proposing in Taiwan, and potentially very interesting. So Taiwan just put in a high-speed rail system that goes in completely linear fashion from one end of the island to the other at incredibly high speed. This thing goes as fast as a Formula One car. So the model here is simply to put city car stacks on the high-speed rail stops, so they deal with the detailed destination problem, the last 10-kilometer problem. So you might go, for example, if you wanted to take a trip from Kaohsiung down in the south up to Hsinchu up in the north, you'd drive your little city car to the railway station at Kaohsiung, leave it there, blast at very high speed to Hsinchu, and then pick up another one at the Hsinchu station and drive that to your detailed destination, and then drive it back probably to the Hsinchu station when you'd finished with it. Here's a very utopian and very conjectural but interesting. This is not to be taken literally. This is just a sort of statement of principle. But one of the ways to deal with Los Angeles, which everybody has always said, of course, is not amenable to any kind of transit system effectively, is to do a mesh network among the centroids of communities. You probably do that with bus rapid transit, with electrically powered bus rapid transit, and then use the city cars on those transit stops to get to the detailed destination. And this shows, just with a stack radius of 7.5 miles, how much coverage you can get in this kind of system. Okay, so let me jump now onto our RoboScooter project to wrap up here. This is another electric vehicle we've just done. We did this one for Sanyang Corporation in Taipei, and literally just yesterday we introduced the prototype of this at the Milan Auto Show, the Milan Motorbike Show. So this is very similar principles to the car. It's a folding, stacking vehicle with robot wheels. It's a two-wheel drive bike, which is very difficult to do with traditional technology. So it has two robot wheels, as you see here, and it folds up. This is a little exercise in transformer design, basically. So that's the way it folds. Whole bunch of patents on the way this folds, by the way. The basic model for this is it has bike racks where it recharges in the bike rack, and has a removable battery pack under the seat there. And there are a bunch of other things that I'll describe as we show the actual thing. So these are the final CAD models of the thing. One of the things that I wanted to do was radically simplify motor scooters in order to make them very inexpensive for big Asian cities. So a traditional motor scooter has something like 1,500 parts, a Vespa or something like that, about 1,500 parts. We were able to get this down to 150 parts, so it's a factor of 10 reduction in the number of parts. We did that in two ways, by using the robot wheel principle. That gives us enormous simplification, and by getting rid of all of the sheet metal and plastic and all of that stuff that sort of messes up traditional scooters. And it's a structurally optimized cast aluminum frame, so everything you see here is just the frame exposed, the cast aluminum. And because it's electrical and just has the robot wheels, we were able to get the weight and the complexity way down. This is the actual scooter. This is the finished scooter. You can see a couple of things about it. The two robot wheels here, rear. It's asymmetrical. The drive motor is on one side here, and on this one the drive motor is on the other side. These little drive motors are terrific now. They're just just 3 kilos each motor, and they're tiny, and they drive this thing along very, very fast, frighteningly fast, actually. Asymmetrical forks, as you see here, you don't usually see this on a bike. The folding, the trick with the folding is an inclined pivot, so that it shifts the wheels out of alignment as it folds up, and shifts them back into alignment as it unfolds. Removable battery pack here, which enables you to lease batteries, so you don't have to buy the battery. You can lease the battery. And this is what else should I say about it? It has LED lights. Has a cantilevered flame seat, which was part of just something we had fun doing. This is the thing in profile. There it is. And here you see the folding of the actual one. That really does fold up, as you see. It does this, you don't have to wrestle this, obviously. Use the power of the rear wheel to fold it up. You just press a button and it just folds itself up like a transformer, and then it unfolds itself again. We radically simplified the meter. So there's just one computer screen that does everything you want, including GPS navigation. This is the removable battery pack. This was a prototype that our collaborators did in orange plastic. The final one is in aluminum. It looks pretty much like this. It's done in aluminum. So you can just slip these things in and out, and you can buy these batteries in a vending machine, or you lease them from a vending machine. So you take your discharged battery, stick it in the back it in the vending machine, which obviously is a charging machine as well. You get credit for the amount of electricity that's left in it, and you just pull out a charged battery. Not having to pay the cost of the battery radically reduces the cost of any kind of electrical vehicle. So leasing these things makes a lot of sense. This is where the battery slides in. You can see the aluminum frame. We ran a structural optimization software on this, so it really is very literally form follows function to get the structure of this thing. There's the battery pack sliding in and out. The seat, it has the tail light under the seat, which is kind of fun. There's one of my ace scooter designers, Michael Lynn, showing proudly riding it for the first time, or just about to ride it when they unhook the electrical cables. And this is the model of the thing in use. This is a 7-Eleven. As many of you know, a city like Taipei has 7-Elevens about every 2 or 3 blocks. So the urban model and the business model here is you think of these things as mobility vending machines. You just put them out the front of the 7-Elevens where they recharge in their racks. So they're like Coke machines or something like that. When you want mobility, you swipe your credit card. The thing unfolds itself like a transformer out of its rack. You ride it to where you want to go, and then wherever you want to go, there's going to be another 7-Eleven within a block or 2 of where you want to go, and you just leave it at the other 7-Eleven. So there we see it. This is an earlier version. It's much less elegant and much less light than the final version. But anyway, outside a supermarket and outside the high-speed rail station. So and here you see this shows you the battery leasing packs as well. This is like buying bottled water, except you lease a battery out of these things. And so let me wrap up here. I'll leave you with this sort of somewhat utopian image, but something that summarizes what I've talked about this evening. Rethinking the vehicle, rethinking the way the vehicle uses urban space in a fundamental way, and then rethinking the way this relates to power systems, so you're able to make a city that's a sustainable, smart, distributed power plant. So these are the sorts of projects we've been working on, and there are a bunch of other ones about to come out that I hope I'll be able to show you next time I'm back. So thank you very much. If we have time for questions or any, yeah. 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 Yeah.
We're not talking about 6
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you do them, so basically these scooters, when they're folded up, are half the size of a traditional scooter. So these big dense parking lots either have twice as many scooters or half the size, and you know, we absolutely anticipate that. I mean, as you know, these parking areas are immense. The number of scooters is gigantic. So really fitting them into a small space is a major win. So the big parking lots just filled with these racks, basically, thousands of them. Yep. Yeah.
I'm interested in the software platform that you've devised for the car, and the way in which you're essentially sort of modeling the entire field of transportation of the city in terms of these 3 markets that you've identified. And then each of the cars operates as a kind of intelligent terminal within that network that's both feeding information into the markets and pulling
That's right.
information out from it in this way. And I wonder how And you had talked about the modularity
Yeah.
of the construction of this, and that there'd be basic open interfaces for the physical construction that would allow for innovation within this as well.
Yeah.
How open do you imagine the software system to be that would allow for other kinds of protocol innovations, market innovations, structure of this? In other words, who gets to see in?
Yep. Yep.
And if not everyone, why not everyone? And
No, the fundamental philosophy is absolutely an open source philosophy on this, and I think that opens up a gigantic field for car customization has always been, particularly in Los Angeles, right? We're in the center of car customization here, so there are all sorts of reasons to customize cars, and so customizing them with software makes a whole lot of sense. And in order to really do that, you really have to make it an open source system. You have to organize it carefully, though. So the basic safety systems can't be open source. I mean, you really have to guarantee the fundamental integrity and safety of these things. But a whole lot of other stuff can be open source. So we haven't obviously worked through all of the details of that, but that's the philosophy. Incidentally, a way I'm thinking about getting these things much more vividly out into the world is to throw the patent of the robot wheel into the public domain and just let people have at it, and because this sort of car is very, very simple. The complexity is almost all, the mechanical complexity is almost all encapsulated in here, right? Everything else is very simple, very lightweight, can be done in small shops. The software can be hacked and transformed and changed and so on. So instead of an industry based around gigantic assembly lines of huge robots and massive investments, you get a much more decentralized kind of thing. And I absolutely believe in doing this in an open source way. Other questions? Yeah, one down there.
I had a question about the parking market that you had described. If I understand it correctly, you're basically putting parking spaces as a sort of free market system. And it would seem to me, if I understand it right, that in a way that's sort of using public infrastructure as another way of marginalizing lower income people, in a way that you could, in certain areas, it would become so expensive to park because the demand and the willingness to pay more can go up, that you naturally exclude people of sort of lower income from parking in certain geographic areas.
Yeah, well, it could work that way, but it doesn't have to. You can put social policy into this, right? So the car knows who you are, right? So you're able to discount rates, you're able to adjust rates. So you might, for example, do a policy where residents of an area get a much lower rate. Basically, the auction is fixed in their favour, right? They get a discount and so on. So I think there's enormous flexibility for actually very sophisticated social policy to deal with equity issues and so on in ways that traditional rigid parking systems really can't do. So it could be. I mean, you can do this sort of thing as a, kind of red in tooth and claw sort of capitalist system that marginalises anybody who can't pay, but that's obviously not what I would have in mind for something like this, but to do a sophisticated access policy through this kind of system. Yep. Yeah. I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch it.
Will be more common to find shipping across all over the country, other than in our country like this, in Hong Kong, where they much
Well, if I understand the question correctly, it's a question about the applicability of these kinds of technologies to the developing world. And I mean, one of the huge issues in the developing world is that particularly in China, is that the level of affluence is rising. The aspiration to own automobiles is rising very rapidly, and that's potentially a gigantic environmental disaster in terms of congestion in cities, in terms of carbon emissions, in terms of power. I mean, most of the power in China comes from filthy coal-burning power plants, right? So I think a huge amount of the application of these systems is going to be in the context of developing countries, where I don't think it's appropriate to somehow say, well, you can't have mobility, you can't have automobiles, you can't have, you can't have the kinds of things that have been available in more developed cities for a long time. So I think this becomes a way of providing high levels of mobility in these developing cities in a way that's clean and very inexpensive. I mean, these kinds of devices are much cheaper than traditional automobiles. The scooter project is absolutely oriented towards the mobility demands of developing countries. What I also want to do this in New York, of course, and I want to do it in Los Angeles. I lived in Los Angeles for many years, and I was horrified this morning to drive down the Santa Monica freeway and discover how much worse it's got in the last few years. So I think there's a lot of application in a city like Los Angeles too.
How do you imagine that pricing would work for the car or the scooter?
Well, it depends on whether you do, there are two ways to do these things. You can use these vehicles, you can sell them as private